Welcome to Beyond the Fundamentals. In this video, I want to tell you how I quickly assess someone's growth stage. It might sound arrogant to say this kind of thing, but I get asked this all the time. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to just walk you through what I do if we're talking about stages of growth, whether it's Fowler's stages of faith or spiral dynamics, any of the growth models. What metrics do I use? What goes through my head? How am I assessing either myself or someone else or someone that I'm doing a one-on-one session with? How does that work? What do I do in my head to assess somebody? Now, if you like what you're getting on this channel, remember to support us. Go to beyondthefundamentals.com, and there are 5 different digital ways to support us there on the donate page. So click that. We're also on Facebook and Twitter and here on YouTube, obviously. So remember to subscribe, thumbs up, share, click the bell icon so you're notified of all future videos. So I got an email from somebody, and this kind of reflects the way some folks think. And I want to read this to you. At what point does sanctification, this guy, Mr. Upholstery Man, says, at what point does sanctification become a stage? From my perspective, Jesus meets us where we are while breathing, after we are convicted by the Holy Spirit, and stick around to allow Jesus to be your Lord and Savior, as opposed to just agreeing that you need saved and look for some other way than Jesus, the only way. While in the process of sanctification, where you may have become a hoarder of things you want to keep close for sentimental or purpose of identity, etc., if the relationship is indeed legit, there will be some understanding that some of the things you may feel as part of who you are the things that Jesus wants you free from. So while others may do things that offend us, we should forgive 7 times 70. There will always be a reason to have an answer to have for your hope being in Christ Jesus, as well as being tested for your faith. I don't see the need for different stages. I just look at it as plain old maturity in a relationship. Thoughts on this? God's only Son permits eternal life. So that's the message. That's the comment that came over YouTube. Now, if you send me something in an email, I'm going to keep you anonymous if I use it in a video. But if it's out public on YouTube comments, I'm just going to use it just like it is, okay? If I want to use it. So I want to address this. This shows the thinking where he says, I don't see the need for the different stages. And this, I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to insult this person. I really think that this person is asking this question in good faith, but it shows the kind of thinking that mistakes a model for the thing or the map for the terrain kind of thing. Like if you have systematic theology, people think in terms of the systematic theology actually being a representation of God or a portal through which you can see God, something like that. And when he talks about the stages, it is indicative that he's taking that kind of thinking over to the use of stages. So as I answer him, I said, these are great questions, but the stages are not really part of reality proper. It's just a model to help us understand growth, which looks at various different metrics. Fowler's model looks at 7 different metrics. There's literally no limit to how many metrics one could consider when assessing developmental level. Why look at just 7? Why not look at 17 or 70, okay? But a model is just a model. A model can only optimize for so many things. There are over 100 different human growth and development models, and they optimize for different things. Many folks have a very simple model with really only 2 stages, like first half of life wisdom and second half of life wisdom. Spiral dynamics has first tier consciousness and second tier consciousness, with each tier broken down into different sublevels. Spiral dynamics is more about awareness. Fowler's model is more about capacity. We're going to talk about that as we go. And then I proceeded to list several metrics by which I would assess people, okay? Now, this issue of stages of growth is just like when we talk about psychology, philosophy, theology, those kinds of things. Those are just categories that we have made up, okay? Reality does not come to us in a silo of theology that is separate from the silo of philosophy or separate from the silo of psychology. The fact that we have siloed these things does not reflect reality. It may be a disservice to us, okay? So I always use this example when I'm in my kitchen, okay? There's not a portion over here by the microwave that is theology, and then another portion over by the oven, which is psychology, and another portion over by the fridge, which is philosophy. Okay, reality does not come in different silos. Reality just comes to us all at one time. And the different silos are just tools that we have discovered, like domains of inquiry that we have pretty much invented, humanity has, in order to study different various aspects of reality. But reality is not really divided up into those things. And so when it comes to stages of growth and growth models, the growth models are not embedded into reality. These are just ways that we try to understand what's going on, how much somebody has matured, how much they have grown. Are they left of bang? Have they had an awakening moment? Are they still sleepwalking through life? Okay, just different metrics like that. And the email that I have, it looks something like this, but I know that's really small font, so I have made it larger, and we're going to go through one thing at a time what we're looking at. And so when it comes to assessing, the idea of assessing other people's stage of development can immediately create a sense of anything from arrogance to rudeness. It might feel like prying or invasion or uncomfortable exposure or being unfairly reduced and put in a box. Okay, it can give people the feeling of being around someone who has X-ray vision, and it can raise questions such as what makes a person feel so entitled as to subject others to the scrutiny without their consent. So I understand this. I understand how arrogant and rude it can seem to talk about assessing other people. However, in reality, everyone is already assessing everyone else. We are actually more likely to put them unfairly in a narrow categorical box by default if we don't bring intentionality to the assessment. We can also overlook opportunities that may help others if we are limited in our unconscious assessment of them. Okay? Bringing intentionality of the assessment of self and others creates a set of fluencies which can only benefit those who have honed those fluencies, like if you're fluent in a language. Okay? It can make a person a better leader, a better partner, a better friend, a better lover, etc., and so forth. Awareness of one's own stage of development is essential for determining what sort of partner would be a good fit for them. So if you're looking for somebody, you need to know if I'm stage 4, maybe another stage 4 person would help. It can also help identify the proximal zone of development so that the individual can more wisely select a peer or a mentor arrangement that will be maximally beneficial. Like, where's a good church for me? Well, if you know what stage you are, you will know to look for a church that has a pastor that's maybe a stage ahead of you, something like that. It can also be it can also help a person quickly identify what type of people to avoid, as it helps spot frauds and phonies. We all already assess people in multiple unconscious ways all the time. Our goal here is to bring intentionality and conscious awareness to our assessment metrics so that all involved, everybody, can experience the maximum benefit and the least amount of unnecessary suffering. Now, when we go through this, if you hear some things that you would like applied to your particular situation, we offer one-on-one paid consultations, okay? BeyondTheFundamentals.com, scroll down till you see book a one-on-one consultation. You can fill out the little form, and you can book a consultation with me if you want to have your growth and development stage assessed. We can do that, okay? But it does take time. We can't do everybody. Okay, that's why we make these videos. So we do offer paid one-on-one consultations where we take all the fluencies that we have developed on this channel over the years, all the things that you find in our growth and transformation playlist, and we can apply it to a specific situation. So if that interests you, go to BeyondTheFundamentals.com, scroll down to book a one-on-one consultation. Those people who have done that so far have rating positive reviews about how much it has helped them. So consider that. It's been a net positive. Now, 2 common growth models that we've looked at so far. Really, we mention a lot of spiral dynamics, and we mention a lot of Fowler's growth models over here on the left. Now, the spiral dynamics is typically a little more about consciousness level, and Fowler's model of growth and development, stages of faith, what they're called, is more about capacity. Now, these are very different, and being at a certain level of consciousness does not necessarily indicate that that person has the same level of capacity. As a matter of fact, I was talking with Christian DeSalvo earlier today, and we were examining, I think this coming Tuesday, we are going to do a video examining what a Anglican bishop said. I think it's Anglican, it might be Episcopalian, I'm not sure. And we're going to see how her awareness does not match her capacity. There's a mismatch there. So we're going to do a case in point examination of someone's growth and development model based on just 2 minutes of what they said. And so when I say just 2 minutes, you're like, how can you get that much? What's happening when you become fluent in these different metrics, you will find that people are just constantly barfing out all kinds of things about themselves to you that they don't realize they're telling you. They're telling you all kinds of things about themselves that they don't even realize that they're saying. So these are the two primary things that we've talked about on this channel. We've taken everything that we've learned here. We did an assessment of Tyler Vela, who left Christianity, and we talked about crossing over this middle line in all these different metrics. So we have all these different charts and ways that we've looked at things. We looked at, this is the one from Mammon Church. We also look at moral foundations theory with Jonathan Haidt. And I had an assessment that I was toying with where the mind of a provisionist would be. And this is a combination of 4 slides here of where a provisionist's mind would be on the typical and where the system is and what proximal zone of growth provisionism is appropriate for. Okay. And so this is an example of that. And you take all these things. And so if you were to line up all the metrics in a row like this, and over here on the right, we have the different levels of growth, and we'll take Fowler's 6 stages. And so you might not be the same stage in everything. And you might wind up with an assessment in every different area. If I were to assess any particular person, they might wind up looking something like this, where they are stage 1 in some areas, stage 2 in others, stage 5 in others, stage 3 in others. It depends on what metric you're looking at, okay? So what I want to go through now is, since I'm advocating fluency in multiple domains for assessing one stage of growth, okay, I want to show you how you're already doing this and we don't realize it. And some of them are less acceptable than others. So here's things that we already do in society, and some of these are societally acceptable. For example, when you meet a child, what's the first 3 things you ask a child? What's your name? How old are you? What grade are you in? We are all already curious about people's growth and development levels, and it's socially acceptable to ask a child, how old are you and what grade are you in, and we can assess that. But when people become adults, it becomes less polite to directly ask somebody, what is your degree of maturity? What's your IQ? What's all these kinds of things? It's not really polite to ask those things, but we ask those kinds of questions to children all the time. So it is a curiosity that we have. There's another way that we evaluate people right off the bat. When we see them, we're automatically assessing for whether or not they are a threat to us. Do they look menacing? Do they look evil? Do they look friendly? Do they look like they might be trying to take advantage of me? Our body does this automatically, and that's not bad. So we're constantly assessing people in lots of different ways that we don't even realize that we're doing. Here's another one that we constantly do when people ask this question, what do you do for a living? Their body brain really is attempting to assess the social status of this person. Where's the lobster with all the serotonin in it? Okay, that's what they're really trying to ask when they do this. Now, you would deny this. You're trying to assess that person's hierarchical social status. No, I'm not. I'm just curious about what they do for a living. Your body brain is, though. Okay, many people will not even admit this to themselves, much less to anyone else when asked or called on it. But we're constantly assessing people all the time, and here are some other ways that we're constantly assessing people. Now, the different colors in this bulleted list doesn't mean anything. It's just easier on the eyes to follow the next thing on the list if they're different colors. So we look at people's clothing and grooming. We look at their facial expressions. We look at their body language. And a lot of this is unconscious. We don't realize we're doing it. We look at their accent and their speech patterns. We consider their hobbies and their interests, their sense of humor, how they treat service workers. Are they mean to the waitress? Group behavior. What do they do in a group? Do Do they become the leader? Do they sit back and be led? Do they participate? Listening skills, tone of voice, who they associate with, their punctuality, their possessions. Do they have a nice boat and a nice house and a Ferrari? Their physical fitness, their risk appetite. How risk prone or averse are they? Their conflict response. What happens when they get upset? What happens when they get in a fight? What happens when somebody challenges them? The amount of eye contact they have. The eye contact duration. Personal space and respect, knowledge of current events, manners and etiquette, shared experiences. We could go on and on and on. People are already assessing everyone else on things like this. We don't even know we're doing it, but we're doing it all the time anyway. So all I'm advocating is to bring a little bit of intentionality to these assessments. Here are some more examples of assessments that we do every day. Okay? Assessing someone as properly and as quickly as possible is essential in order to determine the appropriate kind of attention that we are to pay to them. And we do this all the time. We don't even know that we're doing it. Here's an example of a little girl in school, and maybe she needs an IEP. But the teacher would have to attend, and once you find out that you interact long enough, you're like, oh, this an individual education plan. In other words, they can't be educated exactly like all the other kids. They need some kind of special accommodation. And that's fine. And so a teacher might be assessing for that kind of thing. Maybe we all know somebody who awkwardly invades your personal space, and they get too close to you when they're talking, and it feels uncomfortable, and you find yourself constantly wanting to back up. Or somebody, what are their motives? Are they trying to sell me something? Okay. And it's interesting, like a theological ideologue, like a Calvinist or someone like that, they're constantly trying to sell you their theology. You can see it in the body language. We're covering, I think, Rodney Navy over there at Lawndale Baptist Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. There's a stealth Calvinist takeover going on over there, and he came out with his stealth Calvinism, and he's trying to sell his Calvinism to the audience. And you can see the way his smile is, his eyes, his tone of voice, his body language. You can see all this change when he's trying to sell something that he knows that people may not be interested in buying. Okay? A little salesman. You assess, are they impaired? Are they drunk? Are they on some kind of drugs? When cops pull somebody over, it's very important to assess quickly whether or not they're on like heroin or meth or something. That could also determine how dangerous that person might potentially be. What is their aptitude? I knew a guy, when I was a teenager, I used to have a job at a grocery store pushing buggies in. I would bag groceries, stock shelves, and push buggies in off the parking lot. And I think that's pretty appropriate for a teenager. But my coworker was like a 40-year-old man, and he was fine. You could tell him what to do, and he would do it. And he could bag groceries, and he could get buggies in, but he could not work a cash register. Okay. And so he was getting buggies in, and that's what he did. So you're assessing, you recognize like, okay, this is not your average 40-year-old man. There's something going on with this guy that's not like the rest of them. And you're assessing people. Are they medicated? Went out to dinner one time with a couple, and the kids were crazy bad, and the mother was obviously on some kind of mood stabilizing drug to where she did not care. You could tell she would kind of care, but she was on some kind of drug that she was medicated. And I don't know what it was, but I mean, I remember talking about it and like we were told what it was. I just forget. What about potential? We're assessing people's potential all the time. When I was in Iraq the second time, we had a specialist who was 40 years old. He was 39 and turned 40 while we were there. And he could do things like he could configure radios and load ComSec. He was technically proficient enough to be a signal soldier and work in communications and work with computers. He could fix computers and hook things up to satellites. But he was also tetched, as my grandfather would say, in a way, and he could not be a leader. He had some skills and could do some things, but he was also kind of like a little kid in some ways. And so every month he would have to be counseled by his NCOIC about why he wasn't going to be considered for promotion. And he just kept on going. He served his 20 years as a specialist, and went out, I think got a job as a as a model for Sears catalog. And it was kind of funny because in Sears catalog he looked debonair and intelligent and smart and sophisticated, but we all knew that he was like a crazy kid. It's kind of funny. So we're going to take some time to look at some of these things, and I know this is really small font, so I'm going to go through, I've just taken each one of these, and I'm going to go through these and tell you what I'm looking at to evaluate somebody's level of growth. Now remember, these are just heuristics. They're not absolutes. No single statement or encounter will be definitive. If you're looking at a bunch of different metrics and they all start to aggregate toward one end of the spectrum, that can be indicative. Some people can be read very quickly, others are more nuanced and mysterious. It's tempting to reduce the environment and considerations down to a few simple apprehensible metrics because those are easier to mentally grasp and hold, but it's very helpful and useful to continue to increase the depth of one's awareness and fluency over time. In our Colossians series, we compared sanctification to the differentiation of stem cells, the point in time awareness or capacity when one is ready for the cultivation of wisdom. I would recommend watching that series. So this would be when somebody is ready to move on in that direction. So what are some of these metrics? Let's get into the first one. I'm looking at locus of authority. Is their locus of authority internal or external? Okay, is their locus of authority in their parents, their pastors, their priests, their holy books, their relatives, their traditions, their experts, their professors, their politicians, their friends, their movements, trends, fads, opinions, institutions, different countries? Or they say it's in science. Well, I would just trust whatever science. Trust the science, that kind of thing. Okay, trust the science. It came from a guy who had to be pardoned ahead of time. Okay, sure. Religion, history, cancel culture. Okay, you can tell what people's authorities are if you just listen to them talk. And the locus of authority, I'm going to go all the way to my last slide. The locus of authority is also determined by the last thing. One of the other things that I look at, and this is combined with it, is has this person had to cross some kind of moralistic or values boundary at some point? Remember when Mufasa tells Simba, don't go past the light, off to the north of the kingdom? Have they incorporated such into their daily life? It's not just that maybe they had to make one big decision that crossed a boundary, but do they have things that they do in their everyday life which cross boundaries? They have found something to be expedient. Remember, because Paul says all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. All things edify not. I will not be brought under the power of any. So have they found some things to be expedient, which would be off limits in a pre-wisdom, pre-aim mindset? Okay? And if they do have something in their life, which like a lot of Christians would probably consider off limits, but these people are okay with it, it could be an indication of a more centralized locus of authority. Now, as soon as I give you an example, you would balk at it if you're stage 3 or below. That's why I can't give examples. But in our FSI and in our one-on-one sessions with people that are beyond stage 3, we can talk about examples, and people don't react so crazily because they understand where we're coming from on this and that it's not some kind of rebellion or backsliding or anything like that. This can also go the other way, where they have incorporated new rigidity that wisely serves their new aim. So they may, once you have wisdom and an aim, something that you're aiming for, you may find that they loosen up some restrictions in some areas and tighten up in some other areas. Just like if you say you're already physically fit and you work out every day, but you found out that now you're going to be competing in the Olympics in a specific sport, you would probably optimize your workout routine for that specific sport, and you would loosen up in some areas and tighten up in some other areas because now you have something to aim for. Spirituality is a lot like that as well. So what are some of the other things that we look at other than locus of authority? I'm looking at curiosity. Do they have you figured out right away and presumptively map other people and things to what they think they already know? Or do they curiously explore people, facts, and epistemic terrain carefully and curiously like some uncharted new territory or discovery? You'll find that if you ever talking to Calvinists, they're not curious about you at all. If you're not a Calvinist, but you're a Christian, you're automatically a Universalist, Arminian, Pelagian, Free Willer, open theists, something like that. They don't even ask you. They don't care. They start arguing against. They start their polemic against what they think you are, what they have mapped you to, and they aren't curious at all. And they have no idea that many of us don't hold the views that they are railing against. And so that's an indication of a low degree of transformation, a low degree of growth. They haven't come very far, stage 2 or 3, somewhere around there. And then we're going to look at their moralistic thinking and moralism. Ideologues treat people as if they're moralistically inferior if they have different positions or perspectives than the ones they hold. It comes out clearly in how they argue and advocate for their positions or viewpoints. You're not just different or even potentially valuable for holding a different perspective on any given thing, from the so-called sovereignty of God, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, and or environmentalism, or abortion, or gun control. You are conceited and self-centered and morally inept for having different opinions in them. Now, when I try to say that moralistic thinking is part of being ideologically possessed, people think things like, well, isn't it immoral to kill people? Isn't it immoral? That kind of thing. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is these positions on things that people argue moralistically for these kinds of things. Like, if you don't see the sovereignty of God the same way I do, you're somehow morally inferior. Now, they don't come out and say that precisely, but it's strongly implied. Moralistic thinking and effectiveness are at opposite ends of the spectrum. Thus, people who replace effectiveness with moralistic thinking and argumentation are usually at the ineffective and inexperienced end of the spectrum. We do a lot of Calvinist stuff on this channel, and so when we're covering these Calvinist preachers, what you'll find, since they're not effective at doing anything that practically helps anybody's lives, like the divorce rates aren't getting any better under them, that kind of thing, they are heavy on moralism, because moralism in our minds is a substitute for effectiveness. Now, pay attention to that hack from now on. That's a good thing to know. So when you see somebody who is heavily moralistic in their language, okay, we need to give all the glory to God. What they're telling you, without realizing that they're telling you this, is that they are an ineffective human being. They can't accomplish anything in the real world. They can't pick peaches or change tires or do anything that actually helps anybody do anything. That's why they have to rely on moralism. So the next thing we're going to look at is how aligned with the established ideological system is their language. Okay? The more aligned, the less mature. Okay? Specific theological terms, for example, when they're talking about the Bible and you suddenly start hearing them say federal headship, hypostatic union, the effectual call, permissive will, all this stuff that comes out of systematic theology, something like this, when you see them start using this kind of language, okay, they don't have any experiential knowledge of salvific faith, sovereign grace, common grace, salvific love, creaturely will. Okay, when you see them start using language like this, domain-specific language that is already pre-categorized and predefined outside of the current dialogue that you're having there, it's an automatic indicator of being at a low stage of development, okay, low level of consciousness, low level of capacity. When they use phrases like doctrine of, the doctrine of salvation, the doctrine of tithing, the doctrine of election, the doctrine of blah, 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 blah. When they start using phrases like the doctrine of or the Bible teaches, that phrase specifically, they're almost always going to say something other than what it says after the phrase the Bible teaches. Okay? So these kinds of phrases, what they're telling you when they say these kinds of things, it's that they are thinking along terms of some kind of programming language, some kind of formula or script, and they have no thoughts of their own, and they are cognitively inept. That's what they're telling you by talking this way. Okay, you can hear it immediately. So this concept is also transferable to the domain-specific trade lingo, really, of any particular ideology. So if you just hear them repeating the talking points. Now, adversely, on the other side of this, when somebody can have a conversation with you, and they can follow along when you define terms as you're going to use them only for the context of that conversation, okay? So then that's an indicator that they have perhaps a more advanced capacity. So I might say, for the sake of this conversation, judgment means I'm comparing it with a formula, whereas discernment means that I'm applying wisdom and assessing whether or not it's most effective toward a particular aim, right? And then for the rest of that conversation, so can they have immediate context-specific terminology that they can follow along with rather than ideologically specified terminology that they have to follow along with? And that's the way that they talk. So those are kinds of when people talk, they're telling me these things without realizing they're telling me these things. The next one is magical thinking. How magical is the thinking? The more magical they're thinking, the less mature. This will show up as they talk about anything from their Hebraic Megazeus God, they won't say it that way, or their disbelief in said God. It's interesting because the stage 3 fundamentalist and the stage 3 atheist, they're both stage 3 in acceptance and denial of the same fake thing. Okay? So they might talk about astrology or manifesting or magic rocks or sage or tithing. I'm not saying anybody who says anything about this kind of stuff is at magical thinking, but you can hear how they talk about it. Certain versions of the Bible, superstitions, when people cannot make plans without saying Lord willing in deference to James 4:15, it can be indicative of an external locus of authority and magical thinking combined. Magical thinking goes all the way back to stage 2. Okay, hear a lot of magical thinking with our fervent charismatic types. I call the charismatic movement in Christianity is what I call stage 2 mysticism. Okay, there are naive and post-naive and post-cynical ways of dealing with all of these types of issues. Okay, but you can hear how they talk about them to tell whether or not they got magical thinking going on. Many people attribute to the Holy Spirit that which is actually consequential of their limbic system's interaction with their ideology of choice combined with various synchronicities. Oh, God told me to do this. No, God didn't tell you to do that. Your ideology has guilt-tripped you into something, and your limbic system is prompting you to do it to alleviate the feeling of guilt. Things like that are really what's happening. So this also ties into the concept of causality. Like real causality, not magical thinking. Magical thinking is easy. You don't have to know anything or understand anything to attribute something to God having done it. Whereas there are lots of naturalistic processes that are occurring where God may not necessarily be directly involved in an outside of normal way. So God may not have necessarily intervened in any particular way other than the natural processes that are already in motion. But a magical thinking person is going to be a little on the superstitious side, and they're going to attribute everything that happens to some kind of divine intervention. So causality it ties in with this, okay, because causality actually turns out to be kind of hard, kind of difficult thing to do, okay? And so it's easier to say God did it on any particular thing rather than understanding the actual cause that was in motion, which could have been a naturalistic cause. Now, I understand that if God created everything, then to some degree, everything was set in motion by God and God is somehow involved. I understand, but get where I'm coming from. So causality, the more glossed their causality statements are, the less mature they are. The more magical, the less mature. Things like, that tsunami is Mother Earth punishing you for your SUV and pollution of the environment, okay? Magical thinking. Or that speeding ticket is God punishing you for not tithing, or that disease is God's punishment for your immoral behavior, or that fortunate occurrence or blessing is an answer to prayer. Any one of those statements could just be magical thinking, okay? And then the next thing we're looking at is rules versus circumstance. The more a person's language gravitates toward rules, do's, and don'ts, the less mature they are. The more it's about what's appropriate for a circumstance, typically the more mature they are. Now remember, all of these are just heuristics. None of these have the final say. They're just things to consider. Okay? The next thing we're looking at is how reductive. The more reductive and less complexity can be appreciated, the less mature. A lot of people don't like the things we talk about on this channel because it requires a degree of complex involvement and complex cognition. It's a lot easier. Cults spread. I guess that's in the notes already. If they gravitate for moralistic slogan-based systems and quickly dismiss more nuanced approaches, it's a sign of immaturity. This is a primary feature of cults. Cults can quickly make a person feel more moral and virtuous without any practical effectiveness. Cults offer oversimplistic solutions to complex answers, and that is part of their attraction power. The next thing is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness, and it ties in with complexity. Conscientiousness will lead a person to have more of an appreciation and tolerance for complexity. Of the big five, you have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and you can remember that easily with the acronym OCEAN, okay? And complexity. So the person who is more mature, if somebody tries to get an answer out of me, they want a yes or no answer, and it has to be right now, and I have to tell them right now, and they won't accept anything else, they're probably less mature. But if the answer is a little more complex, and I tell them, hey, you go watch this whole playlist, and then we can talk about it. Sometimes that's a test from me to see how seriously they want to know what they want to know, and whether or not it's worth my time to talk to them, especially for free, and whether or not they're going to put in the time to address the complexity and attend to it. And so the ones that are more mature, if you recommend a playlist so that we can have a conversation about XYZ, I've had people actually come back and they will tell me, I'm listening to the playlist. I had a guy go through all the growth and transformation stuff. Went through all of it, and he would tell me, I'm 20 videos in, I'm 30 videos in, but he would tell me that kind of thing. That is indicative that they are earnest and conscientious. And so that's one of the things that we're looking for. There's hope for that person. Now I'm looking for capacity for abstraction and pattern recognition so capacity for abstraction is a good thing, pattern recognition is a good thing, versus being locked into a specific system. An example, a fundamentalist will look at the gospel as a limited data set with a very specific content and essentially a singular application, usually the point of religious conversion to Christianity. But the more mature mind sees this data set, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, according to Scripture, as a user interface as a user interface or a starting point for a pattern that involves actions, relationships, dispositions with regard to the wisdom pattern of order, disorder, reorder. So when somebody's asking me a question, oftentimes I will start with the most abstract answer that I can offer to see if they can get the abstraction. And if they keep asking questions and I need to keep breaking my answer down to be more and more concrete, it's one of my ways of gauging kind of where they are. Okay, the more advanced they are, the higher their stage of capacity and awareness, the more they will be able to get the pattern. So I will start with abstract answers and work my way down to find out where they are. Now we're going to talk about degree of responsibility. Now in the previous videos, we talked about the locus of authority, and we drew this little diagram, and we separated responsibility. It could be two different responsibilities, like I'm taking responsibility to do something, or I'm assigning responsibility as in blame for somebody that did something wrong, okay? So I'm using this responsibility here as taking responsibility to do something. This one is blame, and then we have validation down here, and these can be internal and external. The more internalized they are, typically the more advanced stage they are in, okay? So the degree of responsibility they attempt to voluntarily adopt, that would be down here with problem solving. So we're going to talk about blame first. The more mature people who are post-naive and post-cynical will take responsibility to fix and correct the negative fallout that exists in their own lives, even and especially if it was caused by someone else. They can do this without bitterness or resentment toward the cause of the negative consequence, which is hard to do. Immature people will typically blame anyone, including but not limited to their parents, their education or lack thereof, political leaders, political circumstances, their ex, other genders, a different race, or other forms of specified and unspecified perceived antagonism. They will use this blame as the excuse to avoid transforming into the person that can overcome the negative fallout. So that brings us to the problem-solving aspect of responsibility. A mature person will identify problems not caused by themselves, into which they are willing to invest their attention, skills, education, and effort in order to help find a long-term solution that will ameliorate the problem, or at least help ameliorate the problem. So these two issues, blame and problem solving aspects of responsibility, go in our locus of authority triad that we have, where we have responsibility, blame, and validation. And we want all three of these things to become internalized, not stay externalized. And the degree to which they are externalized, everybody's blaming everybody else, is the degree to which they are not, it's immature, okay? I saw a speech where a bishop was using external blame for the situations in which other people find themselves rather than like so-called marginalized people. So instead of empowering those people to improve their own situations, which is what a transformation coach of sorts would do, to get that transformation and the change of circumstance to come from within themselves, that's what they would be encouraging people to do. And they are taking part in the suppression of the authentic self and in the stultification of growth by joining them in complaining about externalities rather than taking self-responsibility to change their own circumstance and situation and the disposition with which they're facing reality. The next one is validation. The down there at the bottom of that triad is validation, internal versus external. People often give this away in accusatory language. They don't realize they are projecting when they say something like, "That's why nobody likes you," or "Everyone down here thinks you're an arrogant jerk." What they are telling me is that they care about what everyone else thinks about them. Those who need external validation will find ways to fill emotional voids in those around them in order to be accepted or positively regarded. They typically go for the quick win on approval more than long-term accomplishments. They are overly agreeable and tend to overextend themselves only to resent the commitments later. They say yes to too many things, and then later on when they're overburdened, they're like, nobody cares. Well, you should have said no to more things. Agreeing to the commitment brings more validation reward than carrying it out does, and it's not fun for them because now they got somebody to smile at them and say, "Oh, I'm so glad you took this on," but now they've taken it on, and that's not as good. They tend to crave positive reactions on social media. Men might gift bomb their romantic partner for validation, and a woman might sex bomb her romantic partner for validation. Kids will manage their parents' emotions and become parentified. Parents will exploit their kids to fill their emotional needs. Young Christians will say all the correct doctrinal talking points for the validation approval of the in-group. This kind of thing happens all the time. When you hear a young man preaching, you can almost always hear their need for external validation coming through just about everything that they say, especially when they're just talking the party line, the systematic theology, the talking points, and there's nothing coming from genuine experience where they've learned anything firsthand, especially not any offbeat ideas that might be off the beaten path, that might not be approved by the in-group. They don't go there. The next issue we're looking at is divergent thinking. I'm going to look and see if somebody is a divergent thinker. One thing I liked about Ruckman was that he was a divergent thinker away from how everybody else thought. Now, it doesn't mean you necessarily agree with their divergent thinking, but the fact of divergent thinking. I think Chris Date is an example of somebody who he's a Calvinist, but he also does not believe in eternal conscious torment. So it's interesting that there is some divergent thinking there. Now, doesn't mean I necessarily agree with the divergent thinking, but the fact of it is interesting and could be indicative of an upward climb in maturity, mobility, if you will. So I would ask, do they think only in terms of pre-established narratives, or do they have unique perspectives on things? Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, intelligent thought is non-imitative. If someone is thinking politically, theologically, philosophically, or even scientifically along pre-specified schools of thought, along with the isms that are already in place, this is a huge sign that they are completely asleep. Someone who can think outside of these pigeonholes while demonstrating a high regard and understanding of unintended downstream consequences is a good sign of both intelligence and awakening. Adherence to a minority party line of school thought. This is interesting too. So this isn't exactly divergent thinking because they still have an in-group and a party line, talking points and all this kind of stuff, but adherence to a minority party line school of thought, okay, can serve as a very good cocoon, since people in that situation are forced to rigidly disambiguate their position from the mainstream consensus. For example, if somebody is King James only, okay, you may look at those as a bunch of kooks and nut jobs or whatever, but it's easy to not be. No one's going to make fun of you, and you'll get along with everybody. And when you go to the seminaries and like when I went to University of Mobile, the Bible that was required to be used was New American Standard Bible version, and nobody cared. There was nobody who was any particular version only, so the fact that I was at the time meant that I had to know my stuff. So people who are of the minority school of thought on a thing typically have to study that issue out a lot more than anybody else, because everybody else has the security of the consensus. They already have acceptance and approval, and the consensus is their main argument. They don't have to have an argument. Whereas those who have a minority school of thought position really have to know the issue. Okay, so it's not really popular right now to be, for example, a young earth creationist. And so those who are, they really become familiar with everything from radiometric dating to the so-called geologic column, to hydrologic sorting and polystrata fossils and genetic mutations. They become familiar with a whole host of disciplines, because they're having to look into these things to come to their or to defend their position, that sort of thing. So it can be a very interesting cocoon to be in a minority school of thought, even if they're not exactly divergent thinking. Okay. The next thing I'm going to listen for, is their ontology and locality of God when they talk about God. Whether atheist or fundamentalist, when someone's verbal sentiments toward God conjure up an image of some external being that has specific 3D spatial locality, they are left of bang. Those with a more humble and healthy respect for the magnitude of the ultimate being will typically use more nebulous and nuanced language, and not so epistemically arrogant when they talk about this unknowable being. Not that God can't be known, but in the full extent, as far as everything that God is, cannot be perspectively and participatorily experienced in this lifetime. No man has seen God at any time. You follow me. I'm also going to look at how emotionally and psychologically safe I feel around this person as I'm evaluating their stage of growth. When you feel both safe and energized with sharing offbeat ideas with someone, specifically offbeat ideas, if they're all King James only and you start spouting your King James onlyism and you feel psychologically safe, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about offbeat ideas. That's a sign, and they're okay with it, and you're safe around them, and they treat you with dignity and respect as you share ideas that they probably disagree with. That's a sign that they are awake, or at least high in trait openness, which tends to correspond with both intelligence and maturity. Back to the whole big five. Trait openness tends to correspond with intelligence and maturity. If you find yourself holding back because you rightly suspect to be countered with some sort of moralistic lambasting, or even burned at the proverbial stake or ostracized, that person is likely left of bang, and they are not very mature, and you should steer clear of them, lest they stab you in the back first chance they get. You'll be the victim of their next witch hunt. Okay, you don't want to be part of that. So I'm also going to be noting their ability to listen and attend accurately with their attention. A mature person will be both curious and attentive, and will be able to represent what a person is saying back to them with a high degree of fidelity, and may even be able to lead a person into what wanted to be said but couldn't be articulated at the appropriate degree of resolution. The less mature person will typically be prompted to respond with a similar story or perspective of their own. Oh, that reminds me of one time my daughter, that kind of thing. Or they will map you back to a pre-established school of thought without completely hearing you out and appreciating your perspectival nuances. So I'm listening for how well they can listen and attend to exactly what other people are saying to them. And one of the things I'm going to be listening for is experience. How much experience versus ideology, how much experience is shaping their worldview and what it is they're trying to communicate. So in Romans chapter 5, Colossians 1, in our studies in Colossians, we looked at these passages and we learned together that love as a capacity. So when a person starts their journey of faith, they have love as an intent, but you have to grow into love as a capacity. And once they have love as a capacity, then they are ready for the cultivation of wisdom, and probably not until then. Okay, so that's very, very important. So the love that is a prerequisite to wisdom comes through the exercise of faith, Romans 5:2, through tribulation, patience, experience, hope, and then the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts. When a person's sense of reality is shaped in this way, their words are more careful, they're a little more slow, and their perspective is unique and nuanced. An ideologue, on the other hand, can come across a single buzzword or concept and rattle off an entire mini-system of theoretical thought that isn't connected to any objective experience they've ever had. I was listening, we're going to be doing a video soon on Morningside Baptist Church, and there's a sermon preached by a young man, I think his name is Jeriel, and he comes across the word call in the beginning of the book of Jude, and he immediately launches off into this diatribe of stuff that you would see associated with the word call that would be in a work like this. Some kind of systematic theology, what systematic theology would say about it. So he's like, oh, this is the inward call. This is the call of God on a person's life. Just saying all these talking points that go with the ideology and listing all of these Bible verses that when you look them up, the context is not saying the same thing that Jude is saying. Okay? And so why, and one of the reasons not to probably have a young man delivering sermons to people, especially as the end all, maybe give them some practice and critique them, but they need to be, when you listen to an older person preach or teach who actually has, like if you listen to Jordan Peterson, for example, you will see the tribulation, patience, experience, and hope, and then love. You will see that coming out of what he says from his own life and his own, he just wrote the book, We Who Wrestle with God, through his own wrestling with God. Okay? Now that is worth listening to, but just being a computer, a flesh and blood computer that rattles off in ideology's talking points, sit down. Okay? We don't need to hear that. We need to hear from a genuine wise elder. We need the Yoda or the Mr. Miyagi to actually come and do the talking. We don't need somebody just to rattle off talking points that they don't have experiential, participatory, perspectival awareness of the truths in their own life. That's what needs to be doing the talking. Okay? So I'm listening for how much experience is coming through what they are saying versus just an ideology. The next thing we're looking at is their scope, their capacity for scope and perception of time, space, history, domains of inquiry. Can they zoom in and out? The ability of a person to humbly consider what is before them and beyond them in scope of time, what came before me, what's coming after, and what is broader than them in geography and space is a good measure of how well their mind works, how mature they are. The less mature person has a broad scope of how things should be, like a utopia, but a narrow capacity to bring anything to pass. They can barely clean their room. They are plagued with utopia and nostalgia. As they grow, the vision for what can be changes, and the capacity to make it happen should come to meet each other. So when it comes to actual capacity for what can be done, a lot of people are very, the less mature people are very myopic with exactly what's in front of them. You'll see this like even in theology, just with context. People can't hold the whole narrative in their head when they look at this one verse. They think they can build a whole theology, like Calvinists think they can build a whole theology off John 6:44, without realizing that in the narrative, that comes before the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Don't you think that's kind of important context to have? And the Holy Spirit wasn't given yet, John 7:39, and Jesus said he will draw all men to himself. So this like the inability to see context, and you get tunnel vision on one little particular thing. And this doesn't just happen in theology with Christians or professing Christians. It happens in lots of domains where this sort of thing happens. And then we have the next thing we're looking at is defensiveness. How prone is a person to get defensive? A less mature person will have an activated limbic system and get defensive when their ideas are challenged or negated. They essentially become a talking monkey. The more mature a person is, the more equanimity they can demonstrate both internally and externally. The next thing I'm looking at is their appetite for certainty and finality. The more mature a person is, the more they realize that will not be known. I heard a person I was watching juror number 2, and one of the jurors said, man, the more we talk about this, the less I feel like we know. And that's kind of how life is. That stood out to me. The more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know. Okay, so when a person thinks that certainty is within their grasp, or they think that they have it, I understand the verse out of Proverbs, "Thou shalt know the certainty of the words of truth." I understand all that, and we can talk about that in a different video. But the existence of certainty in reality and words that point to that is different than one's ability to perceive with certainty. Okay, two very different things, and I'm not going to take the time to get into that here. The more mature person, they realize that problems are not exactly solved. They are outgrown. The less mature need conclusive final answers for everything. Now, this is evident to me when even among people who are friendly with me, they're stage 3 and they're not antagonistic necessarily, but when they have questions, they have this incessant questioning. It just question, and no amount of answers ever satisfies them. And of course, I'm starting at the abstract and working my way down to find out where they are on the spectrum. And how each answer generates a new question. So when I'm dealing with somebody who's less mature, they just need this absolute certainty final answer where there's no loose ends left untied. And so that when they do that, they're giving themselves away of where they are on the spectrum of growth. And now the next thing I'm looking for is the role that fear plays in their life, the degree and function of fear in how they think and talk. Just like children who need security blankets, the less mature folks are risk averse and have multiple areas of their life that lean more toward fear than exploration. Fear is indicative of egoic attachment, as in attachment, fear, anger, resentment. Now this is interesting because this whole acronym here of attachment, fear, anger, resentment, I came up with this on my own. Like I got this out of my own experiences, from my own life and from the people in my life. I put this together. And then somebody else found this in some kind of Eastern religious video, and they tried to say that I was teaching Buddhism. I did not get it from there. I got that from real life, okay? It's kind of interesting how people feel the need to do that, though. If people won't try something in other words, you're not going to be afraid if you're not attached to whatever it is you're fearful of losing or having changed without your approval, okay? That means there's your egoic attachment. Where's your fear? If people won't try something because they are afraid of so many things, this is an indicator of a lack of maturity. When people stay in Calvinism because they fear being labeled as a Pelagian or the fear of being perceived as boasting over God's sovereignty, external fear is not the right motivation for internal movement or avoidance of something. Okay? Now remember, these are heuristics, and also remember I'm trying to cut these short for brevity. We could write entire books on any one of these, okay? So just because you can think of an exception to what I'm saying doesn't mean that it's a valid time to do so. Listen to what I'm saying, okay? Yes, I hear you out there. I know you're out there. And the next thing is apprehension versus comprehension. Not overestimating one's apprehension or confusing it with comprehension. And I have this picture out here there's a guy over here sitting in a car, and there's a guy, he was supposed to be in the driver's seat, but I couldn't get the AI to do so much for me. It's about the 30th attempt at making this photo. And then there's a guy out here who's building a car from scratch. Now, the guy who's going to drive the car, you can't do it from the back seat probably, but you get the idea. To apprehend a car, to take it and drive away with it, to take it, you can do that without understanding how everything works. All you have to do is be able to start it, push the gas pedal, change the gears, and turn the steering wheel. But this guy down here who's building the car from scratch, he comprehends the whole thing. So there's a difference between apprehension and comprehension. And the less mature person, less experienced person will confuse the two and think that because they can apprehend something that they can comprehend it. Systematic theology gives the illusion of comprehending God. But just because a model of something is apprehendable, this model is apprehendable, okay? It does not mean that the real thing is comprehended. Very, very different. Nor does it mean that the model is accurate to any degree. How would you know? Especially when there are no truth makers. A person driving a car can have a reasonable expectation of the accuracy of how it works on the inside by the fact that it functions. When people sell us a bill of goods in theology, there are no truth makers. There's no way to push the gas pedal and see if it runs. All we know is that we're losing our kids and our marriages are falling apart. That's all we find out, okay? But we have all these promises of heaven and the afterlife and all these things. Well, if the stuff isn't working for this life and it's not exactly adaptive for here and now, why are we pushing this stuff off? Why do we believe it when we talk about this other stuff? Do things their way for what? Those who think systems and models have anything to do with God are both psychotic and arrogant. And I mean psychotic in the technical sense of living in a fake reality. Like you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or Jumanji in this made-up world of shared fictions. You actually think it's real, and it's not. And they're arrogant to think that. They're not epistemically humble. They don't realize that what we know is a drop, and what can be, what is out there and real is an ocean. There's always much more that we don't know than what we do know, and we need to be epistemically humble as we approach reality with this fact in mind. Those who think systems and models have anything to do with God are both psychotic and arrogant. Apprehension is satisfying to the left hemisphere of the brain when you can apprehend something like this, okay? It's satisfying to the left hemisphere of the brain, and it substitutes for comprehension in those who are cognitively inept. And we see that all the time. So that is another clue that I'm looking for. And people tell me these things without realizing they're telling me these things when I'm looking for where a person is and how I should attend to them, okay? And then burning bridges. I actually saw this. This is an AI-generated photo, but I actually saw this play out. Swiftness to burn bridges is an immediate sign of immaturity. Those who are hotheads and are quick to challenge and argue in a toxic manner immediately give themselves away as immature. Their pet ape is the one running the show. I saw somebody out of the volleyball courts, and it was the first time I had ever met her, and she decided to just get mad and yell at the referee, and everybody knew and loved the referee, and nobody knew her. And so guess what? Nobody wanted to know her anymore either. She was nobody wanted her around anymore. But that kind of thing happens. So immediately, not mature enough to be part. And this person was like pushing 40. I mean, they should have known better. And the next thing, that brings us to the next thing, an intense limbic sanctimonious tonality with slogan phrases. Just need to trust the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, okay? It doesn't matter if the statement's true or not. You can tell by their tonality and the way their limbic system is involved with it. Jordan Peterson's conversation with John Rich was one of the most cringe-inducing conversations he has had that I have ever seen, okay? Where this guy is saying these stage 3 religious things from an apprehension standpoint, not realizing that he's just showing that his limbic system is in control of him and he's an ideologue. So that was uncomfortable to watch somebody do that. And so you can see this during sermons all the time. The same kind of thing happens. But when you're talking to Jordan Peterson, usually his crowd is of a much, higher degree of cognitive aptitude, if you will. And so for this stoop to have occurred was kind of shocking to my system. But that's the level at which, like any of the fundamentalist evangelical churches that are around, that's the level at which people are talking all the time. Okay, and it should be unacceptable. I mean, these people ask me, these churches and the stealth Calvinists are taking over. The fact that anybody is sitting in those pews just baffles me completely. That people put up with that nonsense and don't know any better by now. Okay, we've got to move along, folks. Got to move into something better. The next thing I'm going to be looking at is a person having awareness and respect for downstream consequences. Many good ideas have unintended consequences that negatively affect other things. It's very difficult to change anything in a complex system without negatively affecting a different process somewhere else. Younger people tend to be more idealistic about the way things should be. They have like this utopia view of reality. We should get, unified, universal basic income, okay? They think that effort toward the maximal change in the shortest time should be the path forward, but they don't have an appreciation for all the things that will break when what they say should happen happens. Oh, we should get $20 an hour minimum wage. Well, that means you're going to be replaced with a robot. That's all that means. It doesn't mean you're going to get the $20. Okay? So they don't understand what they're asking for most of the time. Thus, older people tend to be more conservative because they have learned this, and they've also often learned this the hard way. Optimizing for one thing often creates a byproduct or an output that harms the commons or an externality, or doing something that one group of people cares about harms something that another group cares about. Finding the solution that does no harm isn't easy, and sometimes the current problem is its own solution. In other words, the way things are at the moment is really the optimal way for them to be at that time. And if you change anything, it will make the overall situation worse than it currently is. So that has to be borne in mind. This can be connected to causality detection also. Back to causality. What's causing this problem? For example, people were hunting the white rhinoceros, and so they outlawed hunting white rhinoceros and they put a big fine on it. Well, then they started hunting another endangered species, the silverback gorilla, and that the cause wasn't the lack of exotic endangered species that are high value. The cause was dire economic circumstances that otherwise existed, and as long as those persist, people are going to, by hook or crook, find some way to make a living, whether they're selling drugs or killing endangered gorillas. Okay? So let's look at what the cause of the problem is. That sort of thing. Another time there was a solution implemented. Daniel Schmaukenberger talks about this. I can't remember the exact scenario, but they found a solution to completely eradicate malaria in a particular area, but they did something that messed with the food chain and wound up causing mass starvation, where more people died from the starvation than would have died from the malaria. So little things like that people don't think through. So all these young whippersnappers running around wanting to change this and that and demanding this and demanding this, and this is how it should be, and you should have free this and free that, and you shouldn't have to pay for this, all this kind of stuff going on the way things should be. They don't understand the downstream consequences of making those changes. Okay? And so that's something that we're listening for. And this is true in just about any domain. So one thing we're listening for is a person's appreciation and respect and awareness of downstream consequences. Their intent is good. It's just myopic and short-sighted, and they don't realize what else they're going to mess up by changing that one good thing is going to create 12 bad things. Okay? The next thing I might be looking for is the degree of fluency that they have along some of these metrics with regard to themselves and others. The stuff that I'm talking about today, how fluent are they with these particular concepts? I'm going to be looking at that. What's the next thing? The degree to which they can seriously and slowly consider counterintuitive information without knee-jerk reacting in accordance with their pre-established narrative. The ideologues and immature will rapidly dismiss a divergent perspective with nearly zero serious consideration. I got a message from somebody who said they were in a hermeneutics class and they went to their professor who was talking about predestination, and they presented the view of predestination that's actually in Ephesians 1 that we cover on this channel. You know, you're predestinated to these things like the text says. And the professor seemed like a good guy and seemed like he would be open to different perspectives and new ideas, but he completely shut it down, wouldn't even hear it. So that's interesting. So then there's the degree to which the person can spot and avoid logical fallacies. And if people could spot and avoid logical fallacies, they would not tolerate probably 90% of the sermons that occur in churches, especially these churches we're dealing with that have these hostile Calvinist takeovers. Now, we're not going to go over all of these logical fallacies. I think there's 24 of them listed here. A lot of videos that you see floating around just list 10 of them, which is fine. But the degree to which they can spot and avoid logical fallacies. Now, this is especially impressive when it can be done in the context of multiple other factors, such as in groups with high moral impetus on ideological conformity. If you can still spot the logical fallacies and call them out and do something about them and confront them, even in the midst of an in-group who places a moral impetus on ignoring such things, that's good. That's a high degree of maturity, especially if they can do it without being too disruptive. Then we're going to be looking at a degree of emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, this may be a little small font here, but it involves self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, social skills, and the emotions, they're embodied. There's the timing factor. In other words, our mind brain, we can train our mind brain a new fact in seconds. But your body brain takes time. Your emotional body brain takes time to learn things in practice, okay? Caroline Leaf has a book, up to 63 days for developing new neural pathways for new ways of thinking. So getting your body to have new ways of operating and processing and thinking is a completely different thing from just teaching a fact to your brain. It's a different thing. Trauma has a role in it. The vagus nerve has a role. There are different practices that a person can do to have more equanimity in their life. And understanding the limbic system, the fight, flight, feeling, emotions, flirting, mating, freezing, fawning stuff going on. It's important to understand those things. And so that's one of the things that I'm assessing if I'm curious about what stage of development somebody is in or how much they can be trusted or relied upon to do any particular XYZ thing, right? Next thing I'm looking for is something called Asch negativity. That's a good thing. The degree to which one is or is not impressionable. Now, in the Asch conformity experiments, they just brought a bunch of random people in and asked them questions, and they got people to go against their own common sense, to defect on their own common sense at least once, 76% of the time, just because the rest of the group was doing it. Now, how much more when in-groups make conformity much more unlikely and chronic? So when you're in a church of people that you've known for years and years, and they all agree with one thing, how much more tempting is it to be Asch positive? In other words, to go along with the crowd. And Asch negative means you go with your perspective regardless of what the crowd says. I know you all think you do it, but you don't. And so that's something that I'm looking for, is somebody who is aware of this and brings themselves into Asch negativity, to where they can not defect on their own sense making, call it as they see it, even if it means going against everybody. And that's not the same as just believing something because it makes, everybody being against you doesn't mean you're right. So you need to understand that. That's a big point. People get confused on that. Next thing is the 4 kinds of knowing: propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. A more mature person is going to understand that words are just pointers and that the real knowledge is in the procedure, the perspective, and the participating. That's where the real knowledge is. And for words to have any value, then they need to point to those other 3 kinds of knowing in reality. They need to point to something real. So if you can just, arrange a bunch of words in a certain order like this and get people to lob onto them, that's just propositions. These don't point to anything that is experientially, participatorily, perspectively, procedurally real. Okay? And so the more they latch on to something that has no truth makers in it, the less mature they are. So, and that goes for anything. People who don't realize the nature of shared fictions in everyday life and how they aren't really real. Sometimes they're useful, but they're not really real. Something can be real without existing too. Like a property line is real, but it doesn't exist. Then next thing we're going to look at is the level of thinking. Most people that we deal with the lowest 3 levels of thinking, and not everybody is up here. So when we're looking at people and we're evaluating their degree of development, their stage of development, and we're going to be looking at where their level of thinking is in Bloom's taxonomy of learning and thinking. And this is one of the ones that we already mentioned, and this has to do with the locus of authority as well. Has the person had to cross some kind of moralistic values boundary at some point? We already talked about this when we did locus of authority. So we're at the end of the video here, and if you want to have this kind of stuff applied to you, we offer one-on-one sessions, one-on-one paid consultations, where we will take all the fluencies that we've developed on this channel and ways that we assess people. If you want to have a personal assessment on you for what stage you think you are, we can take all of these metrics and we can apply them to your situation. So if that's something that you would like, feel free to reach out. And if you like what you're hearing on this channel, remember to support what we do financially. Go to beyondthefundamentals.com. On the donate page, there are 5 digital ways to donate there. Please consider doing that. And we're going to end this video here. Comment to me, let me know what you thought, and send me an email if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. May the Lord bless you. Have a good day.